Well, welcome to our first of the year legislation writing workshop. So the point of this workshop is going to be talking about two main things. The first is what is the process with which you would introduce a piece of legislation? Sort of what are the logistical concerns and the things that you need to know in order to actually get it into Senate and get it voted on? And then also what is more like the structure and sort of methods with which you actually write the document, the bill itself. So I'm going to go kind of from broad to specific. I do want to say this is a presentation that was made by a previous senior vice president named Kat, and she did a fantastic job. I just want to give her credit for such a good presentation. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of GPSG, and I think that there's a reason that this is important, and I hope it will come across. So this is the structure of our Senate. Now, our Senate is made up of, 100 and some change senators that all represent 76 different units across the university. So so Senate is made up of all of these different senators, but additionally, we have a couple of committees that senators will serve on. And these sort of serve as specific groups of people that spend a little extra time for a multitude of reasons and issues. But there's a couple that are specifically important in terms of writing legislation that I want to specifically point out today. And those are the Finance Committee, the Rules and Judiciary Committee, and the SOGAPS, or State of the Graduate Professional Students Committee. Now, all three of these committees, depending on what you're trying to do, will be the committees that you will send your bill to or your resolution before it actually goes to Senate. And each of these committees kind of does different things and has different requirements. So the Finance Committee is going to be the committee that is going to look at anything related to money, is a short way to put it. So if you are trying to allocate money to a certain event or a certain group of people, if you are trying to change our budget or the way that our money is budgeted in some way, you can add money, take away money, move money around, all of those things would be related to finance. Or also if you're trying to make kind of a general like rule change about how money is spent, or even like if you're trying to do something maybe even related to student fees or something like that, like finance is the place to start. Now the Rules and Judiciary Committee is going to be anything where you're trying to change a rule or the way that student government generally works internally, and also in some cases externally as well. This is a very broad committee, and I would say probably 60 to 70% of your bills are going to go to RJ, to Rules and Judiciary. They handle it, I think they're usually pretty standard. And then the last is SOGAPS, and what they're going to handle are resolutions. And we'll talk a little more in specific about what those are, but that's going to be the committee that's handling our opinion pieces, our statements from Senate. One important thing I want to emphasize as well is that you may need to send a bill to multiple committees. So there absolutely is a situation where you might decide that you want to change a rule, but that rule also changes our budget. And so in that case, you would actually want to send it to both of those committees to be looked at. But we'll talk a little more about that in detail. So if you're, we kind of have three governing documents that cover all of GPSG, and these are going to be the documents that you potentially could change with a bill. But when we're kind of talking about changing our rules and changing our law, this is sort of where we're coming from. So there's four important pieces of governing documents that are worth kind of being aware of. The first is our GPSG code. This is our bylaws. It is our rules that govern specifically graduate and professional student government. So this has a lot to do with like what our positions are, what they do, stuff about elections, travel awards, how the Senate is structured, how basically everything in the sort of way that GPSG functions, how that's structured is within our code. Now we also have something called the Joint Code, and this specifically is a set of bylaws that applies to both GPSG, but also our undergraduate student government, which is a separate sort of entity. And so there's just certain situations where both groups need to work together on something, and so that's why this code was created, to sort of jointly have some rules that supersede over our code. So a good example of something could be like the structure of our Board of Elections. So the Board of Elections, is the group that runs our elections. Well, they run elections for everybody, and we don't want them to be sort of biased or one way or the other. So it's sort of a separate agency. And so that's why we need that joint code, is to manage those types of things. Then we have the Constitution. Now, the Constitution lays out the super general framework for all of student government. There's 3 sections to the Constitution. There's one for grads, one's for undergrads, and one that's kind of the joint section of the Constitution. It's super general and doesn't usually contain information about like day-to-day functions, but more generally just sort of, what to do in this case, like, who has the ability to do what. And a lot of times it's more about like, this person, sort of their opinion, they have first say over this other person or something like that. And then the last is the instrument. This isn't something we as senators would ever really interact with too much. So the instrument is going to be the code that specifically governs our judicial branch and the honor code and just generally like honor court. So anything involving sort of generally like judicial stuff, our Supreme Court, that's all going to fall under the instrument. It's not something that we really interact with. Okay. So an important question that I think comes up a lot is sort of, as a senator, what really can I do with legislation? Sort of what's the point of a piece of legislation? And really, as a senator, you can initiate a lot of different types of change. The 3 sort of main things to consider are: 1, you can seek to change a governing bylaw. So that means pretty much any of those codes that we talked about in the previous slide, you could write a bill to change. Now, technically changing the Constitution is a little more complicated because it requires a vote by the student body, but we can come to that if that's something you want to do. That it's actually something you can do, and we can work out how to do it. But in general, if you want to make especially a change to our GPSG code, that's just something that you can do with a general bill. Now, another thing that you can do is you can take a specific stance or express a given opinion on behalf of the entire constituency. I have a lot of examples of this I'll give later, but just sort of think generally it's an opinion resolution. That's the way to think about it. And then the third thing is to confirm appointments. You can change your budgets and you can allocate funds. So that's like the people and the money are the things that you can do. So you can give money, you can take away money, and you can also sort of appoint positions that are not elected positions, but the types of positions, for example, like my position, which was then appointed by our president, but then the Senate was the one that confirmed it. So who can write legislation? Definitely everyone, presumably, who's watching this, who's a senator, you absolutely can. But anyone is technically able to write a bill. In general, we sort of, we strongly advise that you have a senator who co-authors with you if someone wants to write a bill that isn't a senator. But we also have this cool thing called a signatory line. And so when you're writing your authors on the bill, you can have by, but your senators or whoever, you actually have signatories. And that's really great. So if there's a non-senator who wants to show their support for that piece of legislation, they can become a signatory. And I'll show a little more about where things go on the template in a little while. Now, typically, who authors legislation? It's pretty much everyone. It's pretty frequent for people in the executive branch to have pieces of legislation that they want to see, and so that's fairly common. A lot of times, our chair members or members of our committees very frequently will have changes they want to make, but genuinely anyone can make a bill. And if you have an idea, like, we can make it happen. So talking a little more about types of legislation, and I kind of got at this already. So we've got our general bills. Most things will be a general bill. Any kind of specific action you want to take, again, that's like the money or the people, it's going to sort of be a general bill. A resolution is going to be where you're going to give an opinion. And I think that the way to think about it is, is there like basically a dollar sign on there, right? Is there am I giving money to a place? That's not going to be a resolution. Or do I need to like actually look up something specific in the code that's changing? That's not a resolution. An example might be of a resolution says, us as student government would like to recognize March 18th is Peanut Butter and Jelly Day, and that is an official holiday, and we would like to announce that. Something like that, right? Where we're not really officially like making a rule, but we want to send these resolutions. We want everyone to be aware it is Peanut Butter and Jelly Day today. Obviously that's a silly example, but there would be more. There's a lot of different reasons, and I can give some more examples. And then lastly, the amendments to governing documents. This sort of has different requirements depending on what you're wanting to do, but in general, the GPSG code most of the time is going to be what we're working with. And it's also something that we could do. One thing to know about passing bills or any kind of legislation is that they sort of have different requirements for the amount of people that have to vote in favor in order for them to pass. This doesn't come up too frequently, and it's also something generally like me or Lauren, the president pro tem, would be the person that would sort of be worrying and paying attention to this. But something to keep in mind is that if you do want to amend the code, amend bylaws, or do general bills, it has to have a 2/3 majority to pass. So let's get a little more into the structure of the legislation itself. So the first thing to talk about is the title. And I think actually, instead of going through all of these things, why don't we look at an actual bill? So I'm going to start with this bill template here, and we'll kind of walk through. Now, one thing I want to point out is that this year, in 2023, we created a new template for our legislation. So that all bills in the past years will look different. The contents and the structure is identical. It's really just, it looks a little differently. And part of the reason we did it is because this is more similar to the way that the undergraduate government does their bills. So when we do joint legislation, it's much easier for us to sort of format it into a new bill. But I promise it's very similar. And if you're used to the old template, it really is not that different. So the first thing at the top of the page that I'll point out, so it's going to always start off 54th Graduate Professional Senate, or a different one if it's a different year, 2023 session. And then it's going to start with a legislation number. So that would be something for this year, it would be 54-015. So what that means is it's 54 is referring to the 54th Senate session. And then the number is just the order of legislation we've received since we started this semester. And then title. So your title should properly describe in preferably 15 words or less, maybe, what this bill does. It's okay if it's longer than that, but in general, you just should have sort of a one-sentence description of what is the point of this bill. So that if someone was going to read the title, they can sort of have a vague understanding of what's going on. And it's okay if it's, let's say you want to, I'll give an example. There's a bill that's been going through Senate that's called the like reforming town hall bill. It doesn't actually say what the reforming is, but it just says that it reforms something and it's about town halls. So that's a great title for that reason. The next line here is going to be who wrote the bill. So by enter sponsor here is going to be sort of the primary author. There are some situations where you might put two primary authors. I don't think we need to be too particular, but just sort of the people who, really wrote the thing. Co-sponsored by is a good place to put the people who helped, who edited, who, other senators that helped or supported or something like that. That's a great place to put a co-sponsor. And then a signatory is great because this doesn't have to be a senator, this could be anybody. And so this is anyone that sort of wants to show that they are in support of this bill, so they wanted to put their name on it. So there have been bills where we had 15 signatories because all of these people wanted their name on this and wanted to show that they supported this piece of legislation, and that's certainly all right. So now this whole top box here is going to basically refer to the steps that this bill has gone through so far. And the reason that there's X's is it's sort of just a template, and this is for me to fill in. This is not something that you will ever need to worry about. Myself and the committee chairs will be the ones that fill in these details. It's just kind of a nice way of record keeping. And you can see here, this is just where I signed it to say that it was correct. Now, this next thing, this is something new that we have started doing with this new template. This is really the big change. And I think this is really cool. I'm very excited about it. So what this next section requires is that you put a summary of the bill. So in the past, there's not really a way without going through reading the 15 pages of the bill. There's not really necessarily a short way to know what it's about. And so this makes it easier, a very short 1 to 2 sentence description of what actually is happening in this bill, and specifically what it accomplishes and who it affects. So for example, if you're going to write a bill, and the bill is going to be that every Friday is going to be free ice cream day for all graduate students. And the bill goes on all this detail about how this is going to work. Well, in my description, I'll want to say, okay, so this bill, finds money, allocates money from somewhere in order for us to have ice cream. And it's going to affect all of the graduate professional students because they are the ones that are going to be eligible to receive ice cream. And so I want to clarify that in that 1 to 2 sentence description, and also include a shortened title. This is especially useful when someone has a title for their bill that is really, really, really long, and we just need it shorter for formatting purposes or just for shorthand purposes. So putting a shortened title here helps. If your title is already really short, you can just put your really short title. If you have a 5-sentence title, you don't need to shorten it more than that, but it's just to kind of give it an easy shorthand way to refer to the bill. So the next section is going to be what we call the whereas clauses. So the whereas clauses are going to be all of the background information. None of the information that goes in the whereas clauses is actually going to be the sort of the body. It's not going to be the part of the bill that necessarily changes anything. It's just giving background information for why are we doing this in the first place. These clauses are super important for giving context. There can be as many whereas clauses as you want. This template sort of just has one whereas clause, and then it shows you how to format your final one, which will usually say, therefore be it, blah, blah, blah. It's up to you how much detail you want to go into. I would say it's not like required in writing, but in my opinion, it is required that you put something in this section because we need context for why you made this decision. Are there any questions so far about anything so far? Before I get too far into this? Hopefully it's making sense. Okay, I will continue. So in this next section, so the whereas clauses are going to be separated by this big statement, and it's going to say enacted by the Graduate Professional Senate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill that. You can kind of imagine this to be like the hard line between the whereas clauses and the actual meat of the bill. So the next section of the bill is the main body, and this is going to be broken up into sections usually. In this, you're going to be detailing exactly and very specifically what is going to be happening. Now, so let's start with an example where we're going to make a change to one of our pieces of code. So what you would do in this section 1, you would probably say this bill is going to change it so that we now every year will be required to provide funding for Friday ice cream days for graduate professional students. So that could be section 1. Now section 2 will actually go into the code and pull out the specific sections of our code and show those in those areas where we're making specific language changes. So you can see in this example, right, that they put title 10, title name, GPSG code, and then a number. So this is like our numbering system for the GPSG code. And then they copied and pasted that whole section into the bill. So even if you're not changing everything, you want to go ahead and paste that whole section in, and then anything you remove should be removed, have a strike through, have a line through it, and anything you're adding should be highlighted blue, like this. Does that make sense, what I mean by that? So if it's better don't try to sort of change language. I think it's much easier to just cross out a whole section and then just rewrite it in blue if you want to reword something. Don't try to get rid of the first word and then add a second word. That can be kind of confusing over time. So I recommend just sort of cross out the whole thing and then add a new section. And then you might have multiple sections if you have multiple chapters of code. So if you're going to a bunch of different sections of the code and you want to make a bunch of different changes, each one of those will get their own section. So that is specifically for if we want to change a government document. Now let's go to a different example, which is a resolution. That's it. Also you sign it. I'll sign it and Lauren signs it, but not important. So let's go to the example of a resolution. So this is going to look slightly different. Now all this top section is going to be exactly the same, part of the same description, requires the same whereas clauses, and has that same sort of middle section, but instead it's going to say resolved instead of enacted by the Graduate and Professional Senate. And then this is where you're going to put that main stuff you want to say. I think a great way to think about a resolution is to picture it as a letter and say, we as the Graduate Professional Student Senate want to make you aware of this, and we want to state this, and we want to request this. And then the second section is going to say the Senior Vice President shall transmit a copy of this resolution to the following parties, and you should insert a list of the specific people that you want it sent to. Now, we can send it to absolutely anyone. We can send it to anyone inside or outside of the university. If you want to send it to the President of the United States, I will try to figure out how to find his email address. But anyone you want to send it to, just include that. Preferably also include their email if you can, but it's okay if you don't. I'll figure it out. I also think a good sort of rule of thumb with resolutions is to not only include sort of the statement that you want to make, like I want you to know this thing, but also to include sort of what you want in response. Sometimes you might just ask that, that entity or that person will respond to this resolution, give their response. Sometimes you're asking them to make a specific change to like a law or to some policy. But I think it's kind of a good practice to ask for something back. And so to ask for, for a sort of a response to these resolutions. Are there any questions about the differences between resolutions and code changing? I should also add, so we kind of talked about how you would change code, but if you're also just writing a general bill, the only difference would be you just don't have this, you don't have this section 2. So it's just going to be like section 1. You might have multiple sections, but you're not going to have all this code stuff. You're just going to have a couple of sections that sort of talk, sort of just are general explanations of what's going to happen. One additional thing that you can have that I did not actually mention and isn't technically in this template is you can also have supporting information. So a lot of times when you're, especially with, this happens a lot with resolutions in particular, you might want to have some graphs. You might want to have some statistics or some data. Instead of putting it right dead center in the middle of your whereas clauses, a lot of times you will add that as supporting information, and you will do an appendix at the bottom of your bill. So you can imagine at the very end, like make a full new page and say appendix, appendix A, this graph or this table, and you could refer back to it. Yes, so that's kind of the important thing. This is just talking more about resolutions in general. So specifically, I guess let's talk a little more about resolutions. So resolutions can be narrow, or they can be broad, or they can be like really broad. So sort of when I think about narrow, we want UNC leadership usually. This might be to a dean or to the chancellor. We want the UNC leadership specifically to change a policy. More broadly, it's sort of, we can frequently will sort of denounce or support certain things. So I think an example is at one point we passed a resolution that supports equal marriage equality. I think at one point we denounced, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but we've done that many times where we sort of denounced like national policies or even like world events. We can do any of those things. And really all that matters is sort of, we just come to enough agreement that we can pass it as a group. Yeah, okay. Oh, here's some good examples, like I talked about. So broad scope, a couple of recent examples I'll point out. So, like here's the example of supporting marriage equality, was one. And then let's see, narrow scope. So an example was like, a resolution to reform the Board of Elections. So like this was a call for a reform, or, supporting like a campus health fee or like these types of things, right? Yeah, I think the network quality resolution, I think I would actually consider that narrow, not broad. Because that was a change to network equality on campus, so I think I put that in there correctly, but you kind of get the idea. Okay. Example bills. Those are resolutions. An example of a bill would be, for example, there was a bill to give stipends to the Board of Elections members. There was a bill to amend part of our code to change the way that appropriations worked. Or there was a bill that established a fund for COVID emergency relief. So these are all examples of a bill. So some things to consider, think about who's gonna read your bill after Senate, and sort of like how that could be received. A lot of times, you gotta think about tone. Think about in 3 years, this resolution, these are publicly available for everyone to see. So sort of think about how, I think an important example is like, let's say we want to ask the university to change a policy. I don't think it really helps us to come in to that with like a very angry tone at the university, because we want to work with the university to make a change, right? And so I think that the more sort of open and understanding that tone can be, the more well it's received. Sort of the more pointed the tone is, the more defensive that person that receives it's going to be. And so generally, I think like the softer and clearer the tone, sort of the better it's received, and I think more productive it ends up being. Also, like it's worth being concise. I mean, there's certainly situations where there's just a lot of information, and that is totally understandable. But the more that you can be concise and clear, the better. I think also consider sort of how this bill or resolution is going to affect like all of the constituencies. So, is everyone going to are all of the different constituencies necessarily going to be in support of this? Like, if this does affect them positively, maybe they wouldn't want to. They won't be in support of it. So it's worth thinking about sort of how it's going to be received by the group. I'll also say be aware of the limitations of GPSG, and sort of just UNC leadership in general. There's a lot of things that we can do, but there's a lot of things that we need help doing, or a lot of things that aren't necessarily under our power. Like, we don't have the power to demand that a policy be changed and force it to get changed at the at the high administration level. It's just not a power we necessarily have. And so just sort of keep in mind that like there are some limitations. And a lot of times it's that like the best way to solve a problem isn't just to yell at the policy, but sometimes it can be to make other changes that sort of help lift that to a solution, if that makes sense. One thing that I think is really important, specifically with making an amendment to a code or to the Constitution, keep it flexible, keep it general, because nothing is more kind of annoying is 2 years down the line, someone made a change, which made a lot of sense at the time. You totally understand why they made it, but now the language that they used is limiting something that you want to do, and now you have to go back and change that language again. Where if they had just used sort of more general language in that case, it could be easier. And then lastly, collaborate. Definitely like don't feel like you need to write a bill by yourself, because it's very intimidating the first time that you write a bill. You sort of go, okay, what do I do now? Just when you sit down to write it. So definitely like consider who can collaborate with you. I think a great option is if you want to connect with other senators, let's say on UNC Connect, you're going to write a bill. You could link it in UNC Connect and say, hey, I want to start this bill. Can you all look at this, maybe add some ideas, add some changes, and then we can all have an authorship together at the end of this. The committees are also a great place to go, you know, if you have an idea and you kind of need help figuring out how to do it or how to flesh it out, you can go to a Senate committee meeting and say, hey, this bill, it's not ready to be voted on, but like, what should I add? What do you think? Can I get some input? All of those are totally easy options. And of course, I'm always available to help, like send me an email and I'm happy to look at anything. You know, I help make the formatting, right? So I know pretty well about how to format these things. And also, you know, if you're not sure about like a person or a, you know, a way that something works, I'm super happy to help. So how do you start sort of, okay, I wrote this bill, I've got it. I gotta go give it to somebody, sort of what is this process now that I have this piece of paper? So we'll talk about that a little more. So I talked about this a little bit, but so the Senate committees are gonna be your gateway into Senate. So all legislation needs to be approved by a committee prior to reaching the Senate floor. That's super important. There's like very specific cases where that might not be, but in general, you need to bring it to a committee. And these are gonna be your three committees. So where we talked about, you know, finance for money, R&J for bills or code changes, and SOGAPs for resolutions. You can always find like when they're meeting and where they're meeting on campus. If you're not sure, or ask me and I can help. Also, if you want to do stuff over the summer governance is going to be the one that does that. And we, a lot of times, we pass a lot of legislation over summer. So that's also always an option. So, okay, so in the beginning, when we're working with committees, so the main goal of a committee is not to like, you know, say we hate your idea, go away. It's to kind of make sure that your legislation is written appropriately and is ready to go. So when your bill leaves committee, it, you know, there may be situations, you know, like you mentioned, where on the floor people want to make changes, but in general, when it leaves committee, in your head it should be finished. You should not say, oh, you know, it's approved by the committee, but I actually want to make some more changes, I think, before Senate. Like, no, it should be done. Should be finished. You know, I mean, there's always a little exceptions, but think of it as it should be finished by the, like when you give it to the committee. So when they give it to me, it's done and ready to go. The committee absolutely can propose edits, and you can either make them in the moment, or sometimes they'll even say, okay, you know, we're going to approve this bill to go to Senate, but we want to ask you to make this one change, and then we'll send it over. That does happen sometimes, so that's fine. In general, just ask questions. Everyone is like very happy to help, and I promise no one else knows what is going on half the time either. So don't feel like everyone else knows what's going on and you don't. It's always a little bit of a confusing process, and it's okay if you're feeling unsure. Just ask. Also, if you're going to bring a bill or a resolution to committee, in general, sort of expect to go to the meeting and explain what it is. You can't just sort of email it to them and ghost. You gotta, you know, hopefully in one way or another, you know, can be there or send someone else or, you know, something like that. But in general, preferably you would be in that meeting. Okay, so generally what you're gonna do is you're gonna submit that draft via email to the committee chair. It would be preferable if you could do it 7 days prior to the committee meeting. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Really try to get it before 48 hours before the meeting, but just email the committee meeting and ask and see what the situation is. Check with them about dates and times. They almost certainly will want you to be present. This says that sponsors and signatories are expected to be present. You know, that happens sometimes, it doesn't. It's not gonna make or break it, but in general, like everyone whose name on it should show up and support it. And sort of be ready to answer questions and have that. And then the final form of the legislation is introduced to the Senate. Is going to be the thing that is voted on by the committee. They'll vote favorably or not favorably, and then it will go to them. So cool. Now we're going to talk about going to Senate. So I'm hoping this is going to answer your question. So as you're thinking, the day of Senate, you are going to have to present your bill. We will always ask the primary author to give a couple of minutes explanation of what the bill is. So think about, you know, who's there. You know, there's a lot of different people with a lot of different sort of, you know, that are different stakeholders and have different thoughts, right? So make it general. Try to know know why you're doing this, be prepared to ask questions. People will inevitably ask questions. Sort of think about like limits and potentials. I like this, like what has come before and sort of what opportunities does your legislation create, and be prepared to, answer questions about fallbacks or fallbacks. Word like pitfalls. That's a good word. Be prepared to think about the pitfalls of your legislation. Also, try not to be too defensive. I know this can be really hard sometimes when you come into Senate, and I have done this myself, and I really understand that feeling of you're nervous and you're coming in and you want to explain it, and then all of a sudden you get a bunch of sort of comments of people picking apart this thing you worked on. But really what this is people want to make sure that, they care, they're passionate, and they just want to make sure that this bill is going to be good for everybody. And so, be open for changes that people potentially want to make, and try to understand that, people are not attacking you, like they're not trying to attack you personally. These aren't comments about you in particular. And in fact, they're not allowed to make comments about you personally. It's like against Senate rules. And so they're just trying to sort of be constructive. So sometimes you'll get to Senate, you describe your thing. Let's say I have brought my ice cream bill to the floor, and I want to have ice cream every Friday for all graduate professional students. And let's say someone asks a question and they say, I'm concerned that this is too much ice cream. I think that we should do every other week. 1 week should be ice cream, and then the next week should be nachos. So what they're able to do at Senate is they can call for a motion and say, I would like to motion to make an amendment to this bill. And on the floor, they are able to make an amendment. So in general, they need to bring specific language. We'll ask that person, like, what are the words you want to use? Not just like, I kind of wanted to say this. You need to say like word for word. I wanted to say this, 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 and this. The amendments need to be germane, which basically means you can't add an amendment that is completely unrelated to the purpose of the bill, and they need to be specific. And then once they've proposed that, the author, the original person, can either choose to make it a friendly amendment, meaning, heck yeah, you can add that, it's fine with me. We don't have to talk about that anymore, and they can make that change. Or it could be an unfriendly amendment, which means that in order for that amendment to be added to the bill, we have to vote as a group. And so that would be something we would usually do, like a verbal vote or a vote by hands. And if passed by 2/3, the original author, if it passes and it goes in the bill, that original author can take their name off of it. If they really don't agree with that amendment, they're going to say, okay, if this is what you all want, I don't want my name on it anymore. Take my name off, but we'll still consider the bill. Does that answer your question? Kind of about...
Yes, it does. However, now I have a follow-up question about this last bullet point. Does that mean that amendments which are unfriendly need to pass by 2/3 in order to be added to the bill? Or it's just majority pass, and then if it's 2/3, you can withdraw your name?
I believe it's 2/3.
2/3 pass?
I believe it's 2/3. I can check. The 2/3 thing, those numbers have always confused me a little bit, but I'm pretty sure so it should be on the back of those name cards they give you all. Like I kind of give some of the examples and stuff. I think it's on the back of that, and that's what I usually refer to, but I trust the person who made this, so I trust that number is right. But yeah, it's kind of tricky because there's different situations where it's a majority or 2/3, but for an amendment, I think that's correct. I'll also add, just kind of to your same question, there's also a scenario, and this has actually happened this year, where you have a bill, and instead of choosing to vote on it or amend on it on the floor, the body can choose to motion to table the bill until the next meeting, or they can send it back to committee. And sending it back to committee means that it basically has to go back through committee approval, and they just say, you need to work on this more. This needs more time.